Hello and welcome to the International Daily Roundup by People's Dispatch, where we bring you some of the major news developments from across the world. Our headlines. On the 72nd anniversary of the Nakba Day, Palestinians face an uphill task to protect their land. South Africa's largest private security company failed to pay wages since April, says union. Amazon is set to scale down hazard pay after May, however workers are yet to be informed. Protests rage on in El Salvador against President Bukele's mismanagement of pandemic, and US to consider putting Cuba back on terrorism sponsors list. In our first story, today is Nakba Day, which marks the forced exile of hundreds and thousands of Palestinians during the formation of Israel in 1948. 72 years after the catastrophe, which also saw the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians by Israeli militia groups, the struggle of the people of Palestine continues. The people of Palestine face an especially difficult struggle at this point of time. The circumstances before them are dire. The new Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz has openly declared its intention to annex more territory. The US administration of Donald Trump is solidly behind Israel, its deal of the century a mere excuse for complete Israeli domination. However, the spirit of the Palestinians remains strong and they continue to resist. We bring you this video on the history of the Nakba and the resistance today.
May 15th is the anniversary of the Nakba, which means catastrophe or disaster. The day marks the forced exodus of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes during the formation of Israel in 1948. In the days preceding May 15th, 1948, Israeli militants attacked several villages and towns in historic Palestine. Over 150,000 Palestinians are believed to have been killed and over 800,000 went into exile. According to some estimates, the Israeli militias were responsible for the ethnic cleansing of more than 400 Palestinian villages and towns in few days' time, causing one of the largest and perhaps the longest refugee crisis in human history. The Palestinian partition in 1947 gave Jews, who were 32% of the total population of historic Palestine, 55% of the entire territory. This was opposed by the Palestinians. Zionist militias like Haganah plotted to kill and force Palestinians to leave their villages and towns. These militias were led by future leaders of Israel, including Moshe Dayan, Ariel Sharon, and Yitzhak Rabin. Most of the Palestinians who were forced to flee moved to refugee camps in the nearby cities. However, Israeli militia groups used the war declared by the neighboring Arab countries in 1948 to force the refugees out of the camps. Most of the Palestinian refugees eventually ended up in East Jerusalem or Gaza, which were controlled by Jordan and Egypt at the time of the war. A large number were forced to move to the neighboring Lebanon in the north. The third wave of killing and displacement took place in 1967, when these refugees were forced to go to Jordan and other parts of the Arab world. Today, more than 5 million Palestinians are forced to live in complete misery in various refugee camps across the Middle East. Meanwhile, Israel continues to displace more Palestinians from their existing villages and towns in the occupied territories of West Bank and East Jerusalem. To this day, Palestinians continue to fight for the right to return. In 2018, the Great March of the Return began in Gaza. One of the major demands was the right to return of the refugees and their descendants. Israel responded with horrific violence, killing hundreds. Nonetheless, Palestinians marched to the border fence week after week, demanding justice for those displaced by the Nakba. This year, despite the COVID-19 quarantine, Palestinians across the world will mark the Nakba. Despite Netanyahu's apartheid policies and Trump's fraudulent deal of the century, the resistance of the people of Palestine continues.
The South African trade union, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, has alleged that a private company has not been paying its workers their salaries since April. The company in question is Accelerate Services, which employs over 8,000 people in the country. The union alleges that many workers have been forced to work during the pandemic without personal protective equipment. They were also compelled to register their attendance on biometric systems despite the risk of COVID-19 spreading by touch. The workers have also complained that sanitizers were not provided to them. Apart from providing pest control, corporate canteen and catering services, and cleaning services, the company also owns the country's largest private security firm. The union has also raised concerns of the company's compliance to mandatory contributions to the Unemployment Insurance Fund, or the UIF. The fund is currently aiding companies to pay wages to workers through the temporary Employment Relief Scheme or TERS during the COVID-19 outbreak. Companies that have made UIF contributions are eligible for TERS, but a recently published list of companies availing this scheme does not include Accelerate, which is struggling to pay wages. The company has also not clearly given any clear answer on this matter. In our next story, Amazon is set to end hazard pay hikes for warehouse workers after the month of May. Dave Clark, a senior operations head in Amazon, told the tech news site Recode that the company will go back to its pre-pandemic wages after May 31st. The statement was made when Clark talked about a second extension of its hazard pay for workers. Since March 16th, after much campaigning on the part of the workers, Amazon employees have had a $2 per hour pay rise and got their overtime pay doubled as part of the hazard pay hike. Amazon extended the hazard pay once before in April and will be extending it again until May 31st. Workers have complained that the expiry of hazard pay is yet to be communicated to them by the company. Reports have shown that many are shocked to hear about it over news reports. The company had recently cut down its paid time offs for warehouse workers. Amazon workers have been organizing against recent moves by the company to scale back on added incentives and unsafe working conditions in warehouses. The reason behind the scaling is not explained by the company management. Amazon had a 26% hike in its revenue during the COVID-19 outbreak in the US. This amounts to nearly $75.5 billion. In the meanwhile, the hiked wages and added benefits the company has given is only expected to cost around $4 billion. Protests in El Salvador continue against President Nayib Bukele's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. In addition to the capital San Salvador, demonstrations were also carried out in a number of other municipalities. The call for the demonstrations was given by various social movements on different social media networks. Protesters have complained about the lack of food and fiscal aid to poor and unemployed informal workers, the unsanitary and unsafe conditions of the Salvadorian quarantine centers, and the arrest of people who supposedly broke lockdown. They have also raised issues such as the shortage of PPEs for doctors and other healthcare workers, and the delay in the return of thousands of Salvadorans stranded abroad. Legislators and leaders of the leftist FMLN have also criticized Bukele's mismanagement of the pandemic. Apart from the complaints of the protesters, they have pointed out the administration's disregard of medical professionals in decision making. The FMLN also blamed the administration for stoking fear within the population through militarization and for spreading confusing information. FMLN legislators have also been at the forefront of efforts to extend special support to healthcare workers and fiscal aid packages to support the unemployed and the poor. The United States seems set to continue its imperialist aggression as it considers putting Cuba back on the terror sponsors list. According to an anonymous senior official from the Trump administration, the US State Department is of the opinion that there is supposedly a convincing case to consider Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. The official also said that there is a possibility that such a move may be formalized later this year. The so-called convincing case here is clearly Cuba's unrelenting support to the socialist government of Venezuela, headed by Nicolas Maduro, and also providing asylum for several ELN leaders from Colombia. The socialist government of Cuba has hit back against such accusations, calling them spurious. That's all we have in this episode of the International Daily Roundup. To know more about these stories, visit our website peoplesdispatch.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for watching.